On the night of March 26, 1883, the doors of 665th Avenue opened to reveal something New York had never seen before. 1,000 guests, dressed as European royalty, climbed the stairs of a mansion that had cost $3 million to build. The hostess stood at the top, draped in electric lights, costumed as a Venetian princess. The party would last until dawn. It would bankrupt several families trying to keep up with the costumes. It would also crown a new queen of New York society. Alva Vanderbilt had just stormed the gates of the American aristocracy. She had been born with nothing. She had married into new money that old money despised. She had built a palace to prove she belonged. She had thrown a party so legendary that even her enemies had to attend. But this was only the beginning. Alva would divorce the richest man in America and somehow emerge more powerful. She would force her daughter into a marriage with a duke. She would build mansions that rivaled Versailles. She would chain herself to the White House fence and lead society women into battle for the right to vote. She would marry twice, dominate 3 generations of American elite, and die having reshaped the rules entirely. This is the story of a woman who refused to accept the world as she found it. A woman who weaponized wealth, beauty, and relentless ambition to bend Gilded Age society to her will. A woman who proved that in America, even the oldest families could be conquered by someone who simply refused to lose. From a modest childhood in Mobile, Alabama, to the marble halls of Newport, Alva Vanderbilt lived a life of calculated triumph. If you enjoy stories of American history and extraordinary ambition, please subscribe to support me and my channel. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Lost Everything. Alva Erskine Smith entered the world on January 17, 1853, in Mobile, Alabama. The city sat on the Gulf Coast, grown wealthy from cotton and shipping. Her father, Murray Forbes Smith, worked as a commission merchant and cotton factor. Her mother, Phoebe Ann Desha, came from a prominent Kentucky family with political connections stretching back to the Revolutionary War. The Smiths were comfortable. They were not rich. Murray Smith moved in business circles, but not the highest circles. The family lived well, but not extravagantly. Alva grew up with servants and social position, but she also grew up knowing that position was fragile. She was the youngest of several children. From the beginning, she exhibited a temperament that concerned her mother. Alva did not accept being told no. She did not defer quietly to authority. She argued. She demanded. She possessed what polite Southern society called an unfortunate personality. Her mother worried. Her father seemed almost amused. Alva would need these qualities. In 1861, when Alva was 8 years old, the Civil War began. Mobile became a Confederate stronghold. The Union Navy blockaded the port. The cotton trade that sustained families like the Smiths collapsed overnight. Murray Smith's business evaporated. The comfortable life disappeared. The war dragged on for 4 years. By the time it ended in 1865, the South lay in ruins. The Smith family fortune had been destroyed. The world Alva had known as a small child no longer existed. She was 12 years old. Murray Smith made a decision that changed everything. He would take his family to Europe. In Paris, the cost of living was lower. His remaining capital would stretch further. More importantly, his daughters could be educated in French schools and learn the manners of European society. It was a desperate gamble disguised as an opportunity. The family sailed for France in 1866. They settled in Paris and later moved between various European cities. Alva attended schools in France and England. She learned to speak French fluently. She studied art, music, and the elaborate social codes of European aristocracy. She visited the great chateau of the Loire Valley. She walked through Versailles and stared at the Hall of Mirrors. Most importantly, she learned something that American girls did not typically learn. She learned that aristocracy was not born, but made. European nobles lived in magnificent buildings not because they were inherently superior, but because their ancestors had seized power and built monuments to prove it. The palaces she toured had been constructed to intimidate and impress. Alva paid attention. She studied the architecture. She noted how rooms were arranged to create hierarchies of access. She observed how the wealthy used physical spaces to communicate their status. She understood that in society, perception was reality. The years in Europe were formative, but they could not last forever. By 1870, Murray Smith's money had run out. The family returned to New York. Alva was 17 years old. New York in 1870 was undergoing transformation. The city had grown explosively during and after the Civil War. New fortunes had been made in railroads, steel, shipping, and finance. Men who had been clerks before the war now owned mansions. The old Knickerbocker families, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, watched this invasion with horror. The social hierarchy was rigid. Mrs. Caroline Astor and her Lieutenant Ward McAllister had declared that only 400 people truly mattered in New York. These were the families with old money, old names, and old connections. Everyone else was trade. Everyone else was nouveau riche. Everyone else was unwelcome. The Smiths had a name but no money. They had connections but no fortune. Alva's mother did what mothers of that era did. She began looking for suitable husbands for her daughters. Alva needed to marry well, not for love, but for survival. Alva had other ideas. She had not spent 4 years studying European aristocracy to simply marry the first acceptable man her mother found. She had learned something in those French chateaux. Power was not given. It was taken. But first, she needed money. And money in New York meant the Vanderbilts. Chapter 2: The Vanderbilt Fortune. William Henry Vanderbilt was the richest man in America. He had inherited $95 million from his father, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, in 1877. Within 8 years, he had doubled it to nearly $200 million. This was not merely wealth. It was a sum so vast it strained comprehension. The Vanderbilt fortune had been built on shipping and railroads. The Commodore had started with a single ferry boat and ended by controlling much of the rail traffic between New York and Chicago. He had crushed competitors, bribed legislators, and accumulated power on a scale that made European nobles look modest. He had also been completely excluded from New York society. The old families despised him. He swore. He chewed tobacco. He had started life running a ferry. No amount of money could erase that stain. When the Commodore died in 1877, Mrs. Astor did not attend his funeral. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited both the fortune and the social rejection. He lived in a relatively modest brownstone at 450 Fifth Avenue. He worked in his office every day. He donated to charities and churches. He behaved with perfect propriety. Ms. Astor still refused to acknowledge him. William Henry had 8 children. His sons would inherit the business empire. His daughters needed to marry well. But who would marry a Vanderbilt daughter? The old families would not. The new rich were beneath them. The European nobility might, but negotiations were delicate. William Henry's 3rd son was named William Kissam Vanderbilt. Everyone called him Willie K. He had been born in 1849, making him 4 years older than Alva Smith. He had attended Columbia College without distinguishing himself. He worked in the family railroad business because his father expected it, not because he loved it. What Willie K. loved was yachting, horse racing, and spending money. He was handsome in the conventional way of that era. Dark mustache, serious expression, impeccable tailoring. He possessed the Vanderbilt fortune, but not the Vanderbilt drive. He would inherit millions, but would never build anything himself. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man Alva Smith needed. How they met remains unclear from the historical record. New York in the early 1870s was large, but its social circles were small. The Smiths moved in respectable circles despite their poverty. Alva's mother maintained connections from before the war. Introductions were made at parties, at church, at the opera. What is clear is that Alva targeted Willie K. with precision. She was beautiful, Contemporary photographs show a woman with strong features, intelligent eyes, and perfect posture. More importantly, she was interesting. She spoke French. She had lived in Paris. She could discuss art and architecture. She did not simper or giggle. She challenged him. Willie Kay had never met anyone like her. The society girls his mother approved of bored him to death. They agreed with everything he said. They had no opinions of their own. Alva had opinions about everything. The courtship lasted 2 years. William Henry Vanderbilt was not pleased. The Smiths had nothing. Murray Smith's cotton business had never recovered from the war. Alva brought no dowry, no connections, no advantage to the family. She would be entirely dependent on Vanderbilt money. Alva's mother saw opportunity. For the Vanderbilts, the Smiths offered something valuable: respectability. The Smiths were old Southern aristocracy, even if impoverished. They had the breeding that the Vanderbilts lacked. An alliance might help the family's social position. William Henry eventually agreed. The wedding took place on April 20th, 1875, at the Calvary Church in New York. Alva was 22 years old. Willie Kay was 26. The bride wore white satin trimmed with Brussels lace. The groom gave her a pearl necklace worth $10,000. They honeymooned in Europe for 8 months. Willie Kay showed her the sights. Alva showed him the palaces. She walked him through Versailles again, this time as a Vanderbilt. She explained the architecture. She described how the rooms had been designed to project power. She made him understand something he had never considered. Buildings could be weapons. They returned to New York in early 1876. William Henry Vanderbilt purchased a house for them at 2 West 44th Street. It was appropriate for a young couple starting out. 4 stories, brownstone, respectable but not grand. Alva looked at the house and began planning something else entirely. She had not married Willie Kay to live in a brownstone. She had married him to storm the fortress of New York society. She had studied European palaces for years. Now she would build one in Manhattan. But first, she needed an army. And in 1876, that army arrived from Paris in the form of a short, temperamental architect named Richard Morris Hunt. Chapter 3. Building the Weapon. Richard Morris Hunt was the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had returned to New York in 1855 and had spent 2 decades designing buildings for the wealthy. He understood European architecture better than any American architect. More importantly, he understood what Alva wanted. She wanted a French chateau in the middle of Manhattan. She wanted something so grand, so overwhelming, so obviously expensive that the old families would have no choice but to acknowledge her. She wanted a building that would literally force Mrs. Astor to notice. The problem was location. The fashionable part of Fifth Avenue in the late 1870s was below 42nd Street. The old families lived in brownstones clustered around Washington Square and up to the 40s. Above 55th Street was considered practically wilderness. William Henry Vanderbilt saw opportunity. Land was cheaper further north. He purchased an entire block front on Fifth Avenue between 51st and 52nd Streets. The plot measured 200 feet wide and ran the full depth of the block. This was not a building lot. This was a compound. William Henry announced he would build 2 connected mansions on the site. One for himself and his wife Maria. One for his daughters Emily and Margaret. The cost would be approximately $2 million. Construction would take 3 years. Alva watched this project with intense interest. Her father-in-law was building grand, but he was building traditional. 2 Renaissance-style brownstone mansions connected by a shared foyer. Impressive, certainly. Revolutionary, no. She went to Willie Kay with a proposal. They should build their own house. Not a brownstone, not a traditional mansion, a French chateau. Something New York had never seen before. Something that would make the Astor Mansion look modest by comparison. Willie Kay, to his credit, agreed. Whether he understood what he was agreeing to remains uncertain. But he had money and a wife who knew exactly what she wanted. In 1878, Alva commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design 660 Fifth Avenue. The location was strategic. The house would rise on the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, directly across from where William Henry Vanderbilt was building his twin mansions. The Vanderbilt compound would command an entire city block. Alva's chateau would anchor the corner. Hunt designed something unprecedented. The house would be 5 stories tall, constructed of Indiana limestone in the French Renaissance style. The facade would feature elaborate carved stonework, steep slate roofs with dormer windows, tall chimneys, and a tower. The main entrance would be set back from the street behind a courtyard, European style. Inside, the specifications were breathtaking. A 3-story great hall modeled after the chateau of the Loire Valley. A dining room that could seat 50 people. A drawing room with gilded walls. A ballroom on the 3rd floor measuring 50 by 60 feet. Bathrooms with running water and multiple guest suites. Electric lights throughout. A technology so new that most New Yorkers had never seen it. The cost kept rising. $500,000, $1 million. Eventually closer to $3 million, a sum equivalent to roughly $90 million today. Willie K. paid without complaint. His father was spending $2 million on his double mansion. Willie K. would spend more on a single house. Construction began in 1879. Alva involved herself in every detail. She met with Hunt weekly. She studied the plans. She visited the construction site. She selected the marble for the Great Hall personally, choosing Numidian marble in red and yellow. She designed the stained glass windows herself. She insisted on authentic French and Italian antiques for the furnishings. She was building more than a house. She was building a declaration of war. The old families had excluded the Vanderbilts for a generation. Alva would force them to surrender by constructing something they could not ignore. The house took 4 years to complete. During that time, Alva gave birth to 3 children. Consuelo arrived in March 1877, while they still lived in the brownstone on 44th Street. William K. Jr. was born in 1878. Harold followed in 1884. Alva managed construction while pregnant, while raising infants, while maintaining her social obligations. Contemporary accounts describe her as driven, demanding, and absolutely certain of her vision. Contractors who failed to meet her standards were fired. Hunt learned to present multiple options for her approval rather than dictating solutions. By 1883, the house was ready. The limestone facade gleamed. The grand hall soared 3 stories overhead. The ballroom awaited its first dance. Alva looked at what she had created and planned the final assault. She would throw a costume ball. Not just any costume ball. The costume ball. An event so spectacular that everyone who mattered in New York would beg for invitations. An event that would force Mrs. Caroline Astor herself to acknowledge Alva Vanderbilt's existence. The old queen of society was about to meet the new one, and Alva would make sure there could only be one outcome. Chapter 4. The Night That Changed New York. In the early months of 1883, rumors spread through New York society. Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt was planning a costume ball for late March. The new house at 665th Avenue would be formally opened. The event would be magnificent. The guest list would be exclusive. The old families pretended not to care. A Vanderbilt party was still a Vanderbilt party, no matter how expensive the house. Mrs. Caroline Astor made it known she had no intention of attending. Ward McAllister, the self-appointed arbiter of the 400, waited to see what would happen. Alva was patient. She understood the game perfectly. She had spent years studying how power worked. She knew that in New York society, exclusion was the ultimate weapon. She would use that weapon herself. The invitations went out in February. Each was handwritten in French. Each specified that guests must appear in elaborate costume representing historical or mythological figures. No ordinary evening dress would be acceptable. The level of detail was extraordinary. Costumes would be judged. Prizes would be awarded. This was not a party. It was theater. One person did not receive an invitation. Caroline Astor's daughter, Carrie. Carrie Astor was a young woman of marriageable age. She moved in the highest circles of New York society. She and her friends had been practicing a special quadrille dance for weeks. They planned to perform it at the Vanderbilt Ball. It would be the highlight of their social season. There was just one problem. Carrie Astor had no invitation. She could not perform the quadrille at a party she was not invited to attend. Her friends had all received invitations. Only Carrie was excluded. The young woman was distraught. She went to her mother. Caroline Astor faced an impossible choice. She had never acknowledged the Vanderbilts. She had never called on Alva. According to the strict social codes of the era, Alva had no obligation to invite someone whose mother had not formally recognized her existence. The rules were clear. If Mrs. Astor wanted her daughter invited to the ball, Mrs. Astor would have to call on Mrs. Vanderbilt first. She would have to leave her card. She would have to acknowledge Alva as her social equal. She would have to surrender. In late February, a carriage pulled up to 660 Fifth Avenue. Caroline Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society, stepped down. She climbed the steps to the front door. She left her card. She did not stay for tea. She did not need to. The message had been delivered. Alva had won. An invitation was immediately sent to Carrie Astor. The quadrille would proceed as planned. The old guard had bent the knee to the new. The ball took place on the evening of Monday, March 26, 1883. Contemporary newspaper accounts described it as the most spectacular social event in New York history. 1,200 guests had been invited. Eventually, the number would be revised to 1,000. Either way, it was larger than Miss Astor's annual ball. The guests began arriving at 11 p.m. This was fashionable. Arriving earlier would have seemed provincial. The costumes were extraordinary. One guest came as a cat covered in white cat fur with a stuffed cat's head and a tail. Others dressed as historical figures. Marie Antoinette, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth. One man came as a bumblebee with wire wings. Another dressed as Hamlet in black velvet with a diamond-studded sword. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess. Her gown was covered with electric lights powered by hidden batteries. She literally glowed. It was a technological marvel that served as perfect metaphor. Alva was bringing modernity to a society trapped in tradition. Willie Kay dressed as the Duc de Guise in yellow silk and plumed hat. He looked appropriately ducal, but was entirely overshadowed by his wife. This would prove to be a pattern. The guests toured the house first. They marveled at the great hall with its carved oak staircase and massive fireplace. They admired the dining room with its Flemish oak paneling. They studied the art collection, which included works by European masters. They ascended to the third-floor ballroom. The ballroom was a triumph. The ceiling had been decorated to resemble a garden with climbing roses. The walls were covered in silk. 2 orchestras had been hired to play continuously. The parquet floor gleamed. The quadrille performances began at 1 a.m. Multiple groups had prepared elaborate dances. The most famous was the Mother Goose Quadrille, in which young society women dressed as nursery rhyme characters. Carrie Astor participated, grateful to be there. Dinner was served at 2 a.m. in the dining room. 50 guests could be seated at once, so multiple seatings were required. The menu included oysters, consommé, striped bass, sweetbreads, terrapin, duck, roast turkey, salad, ices, and cakes. The wines were French. Everything was served on china specially commissioned for the evening. Dancing continued until dawn. The guests did not leave until 6 a.m. Many were so exhausted they went directly home to sleep. Some had spent over $1,000 on their costumes, an enormous sum in 1883. The newspapers covered the ball for days. Harper's Weekly ran illustrations of the most impressive costumes. The New York Times published the complete guest list. Detailed descriptions of the house appeared in multiple publications. The ball had cost between $250,000 and $300,000 to host. Alva had achieved exactly what she intended. The Vanderbilts were no longer excluded. 665th Avenue had become the new center of New York society. Mrs. Astor still had her position, but she now had competition. The old order was dying. The new order was being born. Alva had learned something crucial. In America, even the oldest aristocracy could be conquered by someone with enough money, enough intelligence, and enough audacity to simply refuse to accept no as an answer. She had built her fortress. She had won her war. Now she would discover that conquering society was one thing. Living within it was quite another. And sometimes the battlefield was not Fifth Avenue, but your own marriage. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. By 1890, Alva Vanderbilt had everything a woman of her era was supposed to want. She lived in one of the most magnificent houses in America. She had 3 healthy children. Her husband was one of the richest men in the country. She was acknowledged as one of the leaders of New York society. She had won. The marriage was dying. The specific grievances remained private. Willie K. was not cruel in the manner of violent men. He did not beat her. He did not publicly humiliate her. What he did was worse in some ways. He was indifferent. The man who had found Alva fascinating during their courtship had grown bored with her. He preferred his yacht club and his horse racing friends. He took trips without her. He made decisions without consulting her. He had given her money and position, and he seemed to believe that was sufficient. Alva had not married for love, but she had married expecting partnership. She had built 665th Avenue as much for Willie K. as for herself. She had elevated the Vanderbilt name in society. She had given him 3 children. She had created a life of extraordinary privilege. In return, she expected to be treated as an equal, not a decorative accessory. Willie K. had other interests. Contemporary sources hint at affairs, though nothing was ever proven publicly. What mattered was that he was absent, physically and emotionally, from the marriage. He had fulfilled his financial obligations. He saw no reason to provide anything more. In 1888, Alva purchased property in Newport, Rhode Island. Newport had become the summer retreat for America's wealthiest families. The old guard had estates there. The new rich were building ever larger cottages. Alva commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design another house. This one would be called Marble House. The name was literal. The exterior would be faced entirely with white marble. The interior would feature multiple types of colored marble. The design would be based on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. The cost would eventually reach $11 million, making it one of the most expensive private residences ever built in America. Construction began in 1888 and took 4 years. Willie K. paid for it, but Alva controlled every aspect. She built Marble House as her escape, a place where she ruled absolutely, a monument to her own vision rather than her husband's money. The house was completed in 1892. Alva gave it to herself as a 39th birthday present. This was unusual. Married women did not own property separately from their husbands in most circumstances. But Alva had insisted on legal arrangements that gave her control. She was preparing for something. The summer of 1893, Willie K.'s behavior became impossible to ignore. He was spending time with another woman. The details were known to society but not spoken of openly. Alva made a decision that would shock the nation. She would divorce him. No woman of her social standing had ever divorced a Vanderbilt. Wealthy couples endured bad marriages. They lived in separate wings of their mansions. They took discreet lovers. They maintained appearances. They did not divorce. Divorce was scandal. Divorce was social death. Alva did not care. She consulted with lawyers. She gathered evidence. She prepared her case. On January 30th, 1895, She filed for divorce in New York State Supreme Court. The grounds were adultery. The petition named no correspondent, but it alleged that Willie K. had been unfaithful. Under New York law at the time, adultery was one of the few acceptable grounds for divorce. Alva's lawyers had documented Willie K.'s activities carefully. Willie K. did not contest the divorce. Perhaps he wanted his freedom. Perhaps he recognized that fighting would only create more scandal. Perhaps he understood that Alva would win regardless. The divorce was granted on March 5, 1895. The settlement was extraordinary. Alva received Marble House outright, along with the deed to 665th Avenue. She received a cash settlement of $10 million, an enormous sum. She retained custody of all 3 children, though by this point Consuelo was 18, Willie Jr. was 17, and Harold was 11. The newspapers treated the divorce as the scandal of the decade. Headlines screamed about the broken marriage. Editorial writers worried about the decline of American morality. Ministers preached sermons about the sanctity of marriage. Society gossips whispered that Alva would be completely ostracized. They were wrong. Alva's position in society did not collapse. She kept Marble House and continued entertaining there. She kept 665th Avenue. She was invited to the same parties and events. Some women cut her, but fewer than expected. The old rules were changing. Money and personality mattered more than scandal. Alva had gambled that she was too powerful to be destroyed by divorce. She had been right, but she had also created a new problem. She now had 3 children to provide for, including a daughter who needed to marry well. In 1895, an American heiress who married brilliantly did not marry an American. She married European nobility. Alva had a new project. She would marry her daughter to a duke, and Consuelo would not be given a choice. To understand how she did this, we must understand what was happening to wealthy American women in the 1890s, and what was happening to desperate British aristocrats who needed their money. Chapter 6. The $1 Million Duchess. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old in 1895. She was beautiful by any standard, tall, slender, with dark hair and striking eyes. She had been educated by private tutors and at Miss Chapin's school in New York. She spoke French fluently. She played piano. She painted watercolors. She was everything a society girl should be. She was also in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He was handsome, charming, and from an old New York family. He was also not nearly rich enough for Alva's plans. Alva had decided years earlier what Consuelo's future would be. Her daughter would marry into European nobility, preferably British nobility, ideally a duke. This was the ultimate triumph for an American heiress. British titles could not be bought directly, but they could be obtained through marriage. And British nobles needed what American heiresses had: money. The British aristocracy in the 1890s was in financial crisis. Centuries-old estates required enormous sums to maintain. Agricultural rents had collapsed. Death duties had increased. Ancient families found themselves land-rich but cash-poor. Their solution was to marry American money. The trade was explicit. The American bride brought millions of dollars in dowry and annual income. The British groom provided a title, a country estate, and access to the highest levels of European society. Everyone understood the terms. Love was optional. Alva had identified her target. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was 23 years old in 1895. He had inherited the title at age 9 when his father died. He controlled Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, one of the largest private houses in England. He needed approximately $10 million to maintain it. The Duke was not handsome. Contemporary photographs show a man with a weak chin, thinning hair, and a perpetually worried expression. He had cold eyes and an aristocratic sneer that came from centuries of breeding. He was everything Consuelo did not want, but Alva was determined. In the summer of 1895, she took Consuelo to Europe. Officially, this was a tour. Actually, it was a campaign. Alva arranged for the Duke of Marlborough to be invited to various social events where Consuelo would be present. She orchestrated meetings that appeared accidental. She made sure the Duke understood exactly what Consuelo was worth. Consuelo resisted. She wrote letters to Winthrop Rutherford. She begged her mother to let her marry for love. Alva responded with what can only be described as psychological warfare. She told Consuelo that Rutherford had married someone else. This was a lie. She told Consuelo that her refusal to marry the Duke was literally killing Alva, that the stress was destroying her health. This was manipulation. Most effectively, Alva made clear that Consuelo had no choice. She was 18 years old. She had no money of her own. She had no way to support herself. Divorce had given Alva complete control over her children. If Consuelo refused to obey, Alva would cut her off entirely. She would have no home, no income, no position in society. The psychological pressure was relentless. Consuelo later wrote that she felt like a prisoner. She could not escape. She could not fight back. She could only surrender. On July 4, 1895, the engagement was announced. The Duke of Marlborough would marry Consuelo Vanderbilt. The wedding was set for November. The financial negotiations were conducted with brutal precision. Willie Kay, despite the divorce, would provide the dowry. The amount was staggering. Consuelo would receive $2.5 million in railroad stock that would generate $100,000 in annual income. The Duke would receive this income for his lifetime. Additionally, Willie Kay agreed to pay $100,000 annually for the maintenance of Blenheim Palace. In exchange, Consuelo would become the Duchess of Marlborough. Her children would be British nobles. She would live in a palace. She would be presented at the court of St. James. She would have achieved what her mother had spent 20 years working toward. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue. The ceremony was a spectacle. 4,000 people tried to force their way into the church. Police struggled to maintain order. Consuelo wore a satin gown with a 15-foot train. The dress had cost $6,720.48, a sum carefully recorded in Alva's accounts. Contemporary accounts describe Consuelo's face during the ceremony. She looked, observers noted, like she was attending her own funeral. She cried throughout. Witnesses later said they had never seen a more miserable bride. The Duke looked satisfied. He had secured his fortune. Blenheim Palace would be saved. The Spencer Churchill family would continue for another generation. He had done his duty. Alva looked triumphant. Her daughter was now a duchess. The girl from Mobile, Alabama, who had married a Vanderbilt and stormed New York society, had now placed her own daughter among British royalty. It was the ultimate validation. What Alva did not see, or did not care to see, was that she had sacrificed her daughter's happiness for her own ambition. Consuelo would spend the next decade in a loveless marriage, producing 2 sons to secure the succession, and then escaping through her own divorce in 1920. But that was in the future. In November 1895, Alva had achieved another impossible goal. She had forced the British aristocracy to accept American money and an American girl. She had proven once again that she could bend the world to her will. She was 52 years old. She had been married, divorced, and had married off her daughter to a duke. Most women of her era would have considered their work complete. Most women would have retired to their estates and lived quietly. Alva was not most women. Within months, she would remarry. Within 12 years, she would lose that husband. And within a year, after that loss, she would discover a cause that would consume the rest of her life and transform her from society queen to revolutionary. Chapter 7, The Second Marriage and the Great Transformation, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, was everything Willie K. Vanderbilt had not been. He was passionate, opinionated, and genuinely interested in Alva's mind. He was also scandalous, divorced, and Jewish, in an era when that still mattered to society. Alva had known Oliver Belmont for years. He was the son of August Belmont, the famous banker and chairman of the Democratic National Committee. The Belmont family was enormously wealthy, though their fortune came from finance rather than railroads. Oliver had attended the Naval Academy, served briefly, and then settled into the life of a wealthy sportsman. He raised thoroughbred horses. He built Belmont Park Racetrack on Long Island. He collected art. He had married Sarah Swan Whiting in 1886, but the marriage had ended in divorce in 1895, the same year as Alva's divorce. Society whispered that the timing was not coincidental. Oliver Belmont was fascinated by Alva. She challenged him intellectually in ways his first wife never had. They discussed politics, art, architecture, social reform. He shared her love of building grand houses. He understood her ambitions. Unlike Willie Kay, who had simply provided money and then disappeared, Oliver wanted to be Alva's partner. The courtship was conducted with some discretion, but not much. By 1896, they were seen together regularly at social events. Alva's friends warned her that marrying another divorced person would be social suicide. She ignored them. She had survived one divorce scandal. She would survive another. The wedding took place on January 11, 1896, barely 10 months after her divorce. From Willie Kay was finalized. The ceremony was private, held at Alva's home at 477 Madison Avenue. Only family members attended. The newspapers had a field day. The marriage was genuine. Oliver and Alva were intellectually matched in ways she and Willie Kay never had been. They shared interests. They traveled together to Europe. They renovated Belle Court, Oliver's 60-room mansion in Newport, transforming it into a showcase for his collection of medieval armor and Renaissance art. Alva finally had what she had wanted: a partner who respected her intelligence, a husband who consulted her on decisions, a companion who found her fascinating rather than exhausting. For 12 years, the Belmonts lived the life of wealthy, sophisticated New Yorkers. They entertained, they traveled, they built. Then, in June 1908, Oliver complained of stomach pain. The diagnosis was appendicitis. The doctors performed surgery. The operation appeared successful. Then infection set in. Within days, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was dead. He was 50 years old. Alva was devastated. This marriage had been real. This loss cut deeper than any social slight or business setback. She withdrew from society. She spent months in mourning. She was 55 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly alone. Her daughter Consuelo, now the Duchess of Marlborough, was living unhappily in England. Her sons were grown. Her houses felt empty. The social battles that had consumed her for 30 years suddenly seemed meaningless. What had she been fighting for? In 1909, a friend invited Alva to a suffrage lecture. The speaker was Ida Husted Harper, one of the biographers of Susan B. Anthony. Alva attended out of politeness and boredom. She left with a new purpose. For the first time in her life, Alva would fight for something larger than her own position. The suffrage movement in 1909 was divided and struggling. The National American Woman Suffrage Association had been campaigning for decades with minimal results. Women could vote in only 4 Western states: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. The Eastern establishment remained firmly opposed. Progress was measured in inches. Alva attended her first NAWSA meeting and was appalled. The leaders were elderly. The tactics were timid. The meetings consisted of speeches delivered to audiences that already agreed. Nothing was being done to force the issue into public consciousness. Nothing was being done to make politicians pay a price for opposing suffrage. She had spent her life understanding how power worked. She had conquered New York society by refusing to play by the established rules. She had built palaces that forced people to acknowledge her. She had thrown parties that became national news. She understood something the suffrage leaders did not. In America, spectacle mattered. In April 1909, Alva traveled to London for the International Suffrage Alliance Convention. There she witnessed something that would change her approach entirely. The British suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, were using militant tactics. They chained themselves to railings. They smashed windows. They went on hunger strikes in prison. They made suffrage impossible to ignore. The British press covered every action. The suffragettes were arrested, which generated more coverage. They were force-fed in prison, which generated outrage. The government tried to suppress them, which only made them more determined. Whether people supported them or despised them, everyone knew about them. Alva returned to America with a plan. She would bring militancy to the American movement. She would use her wealth to fund actions that would generate publicity. She would open her homes as headquarters. She would make suffrage fashionable among wealthy women. She would make it newsworthy. She would make it unavoidable. In 1909, she founded the Political Equality League. Its purpose was to elect politicians who supported suffrage. Alva rented an entire floor of a Fifth Avenue office building as headquarters. She financed the creation of a National Women's Press Bureau. She wrote articles for newspapers. She gave interviews. She used her celebrity to bring attention to the cause. Most dramatically, she opened Marble House for suffrage conferences. In August 1909 and again in 1914, she hosted meetings of suffrage leaders at her Newport mansion. Hundreds of women attended. The press covered it extensively. Here was the wealthiest woman in Newport, the queen of Gilded Age society, hosting meetings about votes for women. It was shocking. It was perfect. Alva quickly grew frustrated with NAWSA's cautious approach. The organization focused on state-by-state campaigns and refused to embrace more aggressive tactics. In 1914, Alva left NAWSA and joined the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, founded by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. This organization would become the National Woman's Party. The NWP was radical. They believed in holding the party in power responsible for the failure to pass a suffrage amendment. They believed in public demonstrations, picket lines, and civil disobedience. They believed in making suffrage a national issue rather than fighting state by state. Alva believed in all of this. She became the NWP's most important financial benefactor. Between 1914 and her death, she donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the cause. She provided office space in her Manhattan townhouse. She organized fundraising events. She wrote a suffrage-themed play called Melinda and Her Sisters and performed in it at a fundraiser at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in 1916, raising $8,000. The woman who had once fought to be invited to Ms. Astor's parties was now performing in plays about women's rights. The woman who had built palaces to prove her worth was now using her fortune to change laws. The transformation was complete. In January 1917, the NWP launched the first picket protest ever held at the White House. Women stood silently outside the gates holding signs demanding votes for women. Day after day, in all weather, they picketed. President Woodrow Wilson tried to ignore them. The press could not. When America entered World War I in April 1917, the pickets continued. The government arrested the picketers for obstructing traffic. The women refused to pay fines and were sent to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. There they endured terrible conditions. They went on hunger strikes. They were force-fed brutally. November 14, 1917, guards at Occoquan attacked the imprisoned suffragists in what became known as the Night of Terror. Women were beaten, thrown into cells, denied medical care. Lucy Burns was chained to the cell bars with her hands above her head. Alice Paul was force-fed with a tube shoved down her throat. When news of the treatment leaked out, Alva organized a mass meeting at the Belasco Theater in Washington. Thousands attended. The women who had been imprisoned were honored with silver pins that read "Jailed for Freedom." Alva stood on stage and publicly praised women who had been arrested and brutalized. A society matron dripping with diamonds celebrating women who had been treated as criminals. The press coverage was enormous. Public opinion began to shift. Politicians who had opposed suffrage started to reconsider. President Wilson, who had been hostile, began to soften his position. By 1919, both houses of Congress had passed the 19th Amendment. It went to the states for ratification. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify. The 19th Amendment was now law. Women could vote. The battle that had consumed decades was won. Alva was 67 years old. She had spent 11 years fighting for this moment. She could have retired in triumph. Instead, she became president of the National Woman's Party. She would hold that position until her death. The fight was not over. Women could vote, but they could not serve on juries in most states. They could not hold certain government positions. They faced discrimination in employment and education. Alva turned the NWP toward these broader issues of women's equality. When the NWP headquarters in Washington was seized to construct the Supreme Court building, Alva did something remarkable. She purchased a large historic home near the U.S. Capitol and donated it to the organization. The building, dedicated in 1931, would become known as the Sewell Belmont House. It still serves as NWP headquarters today. The woman who had once built palaces for herself was now building headquarters for a movement. The woman who had forced her daughter into an aristocratic marriage was now working to ensure other women had choices she and Consuelo had lacked. Alva had undergone a transformation that few of her contemporaries could have predicted. But perhaps it made sense. She had spent her life refusing to accept the world as she found it. She had bent society to her will through sheer determination. Now she was bending the laws themselves. She had learned that buildings could be weapons. Now she had learned that so could protests, picket lines, and prison sentences endured for principle. Chapter 8. The Legacy. In the early 1920s, Alva moved to France to be near her daughter Consuelo. The Duchess of Marlborough had finally escaped her own unhappy marriage, divorcing the Duke in 1920. Mother and daughter, both divorced from their first husbands, both survivors of the social system that had nearly destroyed them, found a new relationship based on mutual understanding. Alva maintained an apartment in Paris at 1 Avenue du Bois de Boulogne. She traveled between France and America. She continued her work for the National Woman's Party. She remained president of the organization, wielding influence from across the Atlantic. She wrote articles, she gave speeches, she fundraised. The fight never stopped. Even in her 70s, Alva remained formidable. She attended suffrage meetings across Europe. She met with activists from different countries. She shared strategies and tactics. The movement that had begun in America and Britain was spreading globally, and Alva wanted to be part of that expansion. She also worked on her memoirs, though they would never be published in her lifetime. She wanted to tell her story in her own words. She wanted to explain how the girl from Mobile had become the woman who changed America. She wanted to justify her choices, especially the decision to force Consuelo into marriage with the Duke. In her later writings, Alva seemed to acknowledge that she had been wrong about Consuelo. She had treated her daughter as she herself had been treated by society, as a commodity to be traded for social advancement. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent the last 15 years of her life fighting for women's rights while having denied those same rights to her own daughter when it mattered most. But Alva did not apologize. That was not her way. She simply moved forward, trying to build a world where other mothers would not make the same choices she had made, where other daughters would have options Consuelo had lacked. On January 26, 1933, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont suffered a stroke at her Paris apartment. She was 80 years old. She died the same day. The news reached America within hours. The newspapers that had once covered her costume balls now covered her death. But the tone had changed. The obituaries were respectful, even admiring. They focused not on her social triumphs, but on her suffrage work. The New York Times headline read, "Mrs. Belmont, leader in suffrage, dies." Her funeral was held at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York City, the same church where her daughter Consuelo had married the Duke of Marlborough 38 years earlier. The service featured all female pallbearers, a deliberate choice that made a statement, even in death. The pallbearers included leaders of the National Woman's Party and other suffrage organizations. Hundreds of suffragists attended, honoring the woman who had funded their movement and fought alongside them. In her will, Alva left $100,000 to the National Woman's Party, equivalent to nearly $2 million today. She also left the Sewall Belmont House to the organization, ensuring it would have a permanent home. She left substantial sums to her children and grandchildren. She left instructions that she be buried alongside Oliver Belmont in the Belmont Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Girl from Mobile, Alabama, who lost everything in the Civil War, became the woman who changed American history. She did it by building palaces and throwing parties that forced the old guard to surrender. She did it by divorcing when divorce meant social death and surviving anyway. She did it by eventually standing on picket lines and funding revolutionaries and going to jail for a cause larger than herself. She was the widow who ruled Gilded Age society. She was also the warrior who helped win women the vote. She was both. She was neither. She was entirely herself, unapologetically, relentlessly, until the day she died at age 80 in Paris, an ocean away from the Mobile where she had started, and the New York she had conquered. And that, perhaps, is the most revolutionary thing of all. In an era that tried to define women narrowly, that tried to keep them in assigned roles, that tried to limit their ambitions to marriage and motherhood, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont lived entirely on her own terms. She broke every rule. She refused every limitation. She transformed herself repeatedly, from Southern belle to society queen to revolutionary, and she did it all without asking permission from anyone. Her life was her greatest creation, more enduring than any mansion, more powerful than any costume ball, more important than any social triumph. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont built herself over and over again until she became exactly who she wanted to be. And in doing so, she helped build a world where other women could do the same.